All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into a true crime story.
Yeah.
That's really captivated a lot of people. The Jane Dorotik case.
Yeah.
And we're working off of excerpts you provided from the Wondery podcast, 48 Hours, The Troubled Case Against Jane Dorotik. And it's a wild one.
It is a wild one. It's so interesting how what initially seems like an open and shut case, like quickly unravels as you learn more about it and you start to see conflicting evidence and, the idea that the justice system might not always get it right.
Yeah, and that's what's so compelling about this story, right? I mean, for almost 20 years, Jane Dorotik was in prison for the murder of her husband, Bob.
Right.
Back in 2000.
Right.
And then in 2022, new evidence emerges. Charges are dropped, and she's a free woman. But that doesn't mean the story's over.
Yeah.
So many unanswered questions.
Absolutely.
So let's unpack this a little bit. Let's go back to the beginning. Paint the picture for us. Who are the Dorotiks?
So the Dorotiks on the surface seemed like a pretty average happy family. They lived on a ranch in San Diego. They had 3 kids. They had shared interests. Jane loved her horses. Bob was an avid jogger.
Okay, so seemingly idyllic life.
Yeah.
But take us to February 13th, 2000. Bob goes for a jog.
Right.
And he vanishes.
Yeah, he never comes home.
Jane reports him missing, and his body's discovered the next day.
Exactly.
So this is where things take a really dark turn, right?
This is where the story really starts to unfold. And this is where the investigation starts to zero in on Jane. And the prosecution starts building what seems like a pretty strong case against her.
So walk us through that. What is the prosecution's theory here? And what evidence do they have?
So their theory was that the murder actually took place in the Dorotiks' bedroom. And one of the key pieces of evidence that they presented was blood spatter. Blood spatter found on the bedding on the ceiling.
So let's talk about that blood spatter for a second.
Okay.
What did the prosecution make of it? And how strong was this evidence?
They argued that the blood spatter patterns were consistent with a violent attack, and they really honed in on that to point at Jane as being the aggressor.
Okay, so we've got blood spatter in the bedroom. What else?
Okay, so then there was a bloody syringe that was discovered in the bathroom trash can, and Jane was a nurse and claimed that she used the syringe for her horses. But the syringe had both Bob's blood and Jane's fingerprint on it.
So a syringe with both the victim's blood and the suspect's fingerprint. I mean,
Right.
that seems pretty incriminating.
It does.
Was there anything more?
Yeah. So they also had tire tracks that were found near Bob's body that they were able to match to Jane's truck.
Okay.
And then you have the testimony of Jane's sons, Nick and Alex.
Well, hold on. Their own children
Yeah.
testified against her.
They did.
That adds a whole other level
That's
of complexity to this case. So what did they say?
So they painted a picture of a troubled marriage claiming that their parents fought frequently and suggested that Jane may have had a motive based on these marital problems.
I mean, just the thought of your own children testifying against you in a murder trial.
Right.
That's got to be just devastating.
Yeah.
But legally speaking, how much weight does that kind of testimony carry?
That's a good question. I mean, eyewitness testimony, especially from family members, can be really persuasive to a jury. But it's important to keep in mind that eyewitness accounts can be unreliable. They can be influenced by stress or personal bias or even just faulty memory.
Yeah, totally. So we've got blood spatter.
Yeah.
We've got the bloody syringe. We've got tire tracks. We've got the son's testimony. It seems like the prosecution had a really compelling case here.
Yeah.
What did the defense do to counter all of this?
So this is where it gets really interesting. Instead of trying to refute the physical evidence directly, the defense took a very surprising and I think many people would say risky approach. They actually accepted the bedroom as the murder scene, but they shifted the blame. They pointed the finger at Jane's daughter, Claire.
Wait, they blames the daughter. Why would they do that?
So their argument was that Claire harbored resentment towards her father because he had threatened to sell her beloved horses.
Oh.
And they claimed that she was physically capable of committing the murder and had the opportunity to do it.
Wow, that's a bold move to basically put the daughter on trial to try to save the mother. What was the jury's reaction to this?
Well, unfortunately for Jane, the jury didn't buy it.
Okay.
They found her guilty and she was sentenced to 25 years to life.
So at this point, it feels like it's all over for Jane, but this is really just the beginning of her fight for freedom, isn't it?
It is.
What happens next?
So while she was in prison, Jane became her own advocate. She was relentlessly pursuing every avenue to prove her innocence. She filed countless motions. She sought out help from innocence projects. She never gave up hope.
That's incredible.
It really is.
I mean, what was it that she was so determined to prove?
She was adamant that the key pieces of evidence needed to be retested using modern DNA technology. Remember, this was the early 2000s, and DNA analysis wasn't as advanced or as widely used as it is today.
Right.
And she believed that this could be the key to exonerating her.
So after years of legal battles, did she finally get the DNA testing that she fought so hard for?
She did. In 2015, the court finally granted her request, and the results were groundbreaking. They found foreign male DNA that didn't belong to anyone in the family on the rope around Bob's neck, his fingernail clippings in his clothing. And here's the crucial part. None of Jane's DNA was found on any of the key evidence.
That's a game changer.
Mm.
I mean, that completely contradicts the prosecution's theory
Right.
and throws this whole case into question.
Absolutely.
But what about that blood evidence that was found in the bedroom? Did the new DNA testing provide any insights into that?
That's where things get even more interesting. It turns out that not all the bloodstains were actually tested during the initial investigation. And further analysis revealed that some of the stains that they initially thought were blood weren't blood at all.
Wait a minute. So they presented this blood evidence to the jury as if it had been thoroughly examined and confirmed to be Bob's blood, but that wasn't entirely accurate.
Not quite. They tested a limited number of samples and made assumptions about the rest, which, as we now know, turned out to be incorrect. And to make matters worse, there was even photographic evidence of an investigator handling evidence without gloves.
Handling murder evidence with his bare hands. I mean, that seems like a major breach of protocol.
It is.
What are the implications of this kind of mishandling of evidence?
Well, it raises serious concerns about contamination and calls into question the reliability of the entire forensic investigation. In any criminal case, especially one involving DNA, maintaining the chain of custody, making sure that evidence is properly collected, documented, and protected from contamination, that's absolutely crucial. Any break in that chain can compromise the integrity of the evidence and potentially lead to a wrongful conviction.
Okay, so we have this new DNA evidence that excludes Jane. We've got questions about the blood evidence. We've got potential contamination of the crime scene. With all of this coming to light, what happens next? Was Jane immediately released?
Not exactly. It was a long road. The legal system moves slowly, especially when it comes to overturning convictions.
So even with this new evidence, it wasn't just over for her. What happened?
Well, there were a series of legal proceedings and appeals, and her conviction was initially overturned.
Okay.
Which, must have felt like a huge victory for Jane.
Yeah.
But then the district attorney's office decided to retry her.
Wait, so they wanted to put her through another trial, even after the DNA evidence pointed away from her? That's unbelievable.
It just goes to show how complex the justice system is sometimes. Sometimes there's a reluctance to admit mistakes, and prosecutors can feel pressure to secure a conviction, even when new evidence really challenges the original case.
Yeah, so what happened with this retrial?
So during the pretrial hearings, there was a really significant development. The judge ruled that some of the key evidence, including the tire tracks that the prosecution had linked to Jane's truck, was inadmissible.
Inadmissible, what does that mean?
It means that the judge determined that the evidence wasn't collected or analyzed properly, and so it couldn't be used against Jane in court.
Okay.
And this ruling was a major blow to the prosecution's case.
It sounds like their case was really starting to fall apart at this point. So what happened next?
Well, just when everyone was getting ready for the retrial to start, jury selection was already underway. The prosecution made a surprise announcement. They dropped all charges against Jane.
Wow. Finally, after all those years, she's free. It must have been an incredibly emotional moment for her and for her supporters. But even though the legal battle is over, I imagine there are still scars left from this whole ordeal.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this whole case raises some really profound questions about the psychological and emotional impact of wrongful convictions. I mean, just imagine the trauma of being wrongly accused, being imprisoned, separated from your loved ones for a crime you didn't commit. And then even after you're exonerated, there's the challenge of rebuilding your life and dealing with the stigma that can linger even after you've been cleared.
And then in this case, you have this added layer of her children being involved in the trial, testifying against her.
Right.
I can't even imagine how that experience affected their family dynamics.
Yeah. It's a lot to process. Think about the impact on Jane's sons who testified against their mother based on their perception of her at the time.
Right.
And then years later, they learned that the evidence against her was flawed and she may have been innocent all along.
Yeah.
That has to have a profound impact on their understanding of their family history, their relationship with their mother.
It's a stark reminder that the justice system doesn't just operate in a vacuum.
It doesn't.
These cases involve real people with complex lives and relationships,
Right.
and the consequences of a wrongful conviction can ripple outward,
Absolutely.
affecting entire families for generations.
And it brings up another really crucial aspect of this case that we haven't really touched upon yet, and that's the victim, Bob Dorotik.
Yeah.
While we've been focusing on Jane's fight for freedom and the flaws in the investigation, it's important to remember that a man lost his life,
Absolutely.
and his murder remains unsolved.
It's easy to get caught up in the legal drama and, the question of Jane's guilt or innocence.
Right.
But, yeah, we can't forget about Bob. What about justice for him and his family?
Well, that's the lingering question that hangs over this entire case.
Right.
Even though Jane has been exonerated, the real killer is still out there. And this raises questions about the investigative process. Once the focus shifted to Jane, were other potential leads adequately explored?
Right.
Was there tunnel vision on the part of investigators?
And what about now? Is there any ongoing investigation into Bob's murder, or has the case just gone cold?
That's unclear. The podcast doesn't really go into whether or not there are any active efforts to find Bob's killer. And this happens a lot in these kinds of cases where someone has already been convicted. The focus shifts to the legal battle, and the search for the actual perpetrator can really take a back seat.
So while Jane's story is ultimately one of resilience and a victory for justice,
Yeah,
it's also a story of loss,
absolutely.
unanswered questions,
Yeah,
and the complexities of the legal system.
I think that's a really insightful observation. This case is not just about Jane's individual struggle. It reflects broader issues within our criminal justice system. The potential for error, the reliance on potentially flawed forensic evidence, the challenges of overturning convictions, and the importance of continuing to seek the truth even when a case is considered closed.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
We've uncovered so many layers of this story,
Yeah,
and I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the case now.
yeah.
But as we've discussed, there's still so many unanswered questions. What happened to Bob Dorotik?
Right.
Who is responsible for his death? Will his family ever get closure?
Those are the questions that really linger long after the legal battles are over, and I think maybe that's the most haunting aspect of this whole case. The sense of incompleteness, the knowledge that even though Jane is free, justice for Bob remains elusive.
Yeah, it's hard not to think about the human cost of all of this.
Yeah,
The impact on everyone involved, especially Jane's children.
absolutely. Imagine being, in the middle of all of that. First, your father is murdered, then your mother is accused, and you're called to testify. You're basically forced to, re-examine your family dynamics under a microscope. And then years later, the foundation of that whole narrative is just shattered when the truth about the evidence finally comes out.
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about your family, about justice, about your own memories even. We talked about Jane's resilience, but what about her children? How do they come to terms with such a mind-blowing experience?
Yeah, I mean, it really highlights how these cases have such a lasting impact, how they affect so many people beyond just the courtroom. And it also presents this really interesting ethical dilemma, the defense's decision to point the finger at Claire, even though it was a legal strategy. I mean, that had to have created some serious tension within the family.
Yeah, can that kind of damage ever really be fully repaired?
Yeah,
It's a tough question.
it is.
On the one hand, you can understand the defense attorney's perspective. They're doing everything they can to protect their client.
Right.
But on the other hand, the potential consequences for Claire being, thrust into the middle of all of this are huge. I mean, if you think about how far we're willing to go to defend someone, even if it means potentially harming someone else.
And in this case, it backfired. It didn't help Jane's case, and it may have fractured her relationship with her daughter. It's just a reminder that legal strategies can have these unintended consequences, especially in cases that are already so emotionally charged.
This whole case is just a cautionary tale, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it exposes the flaws in the system, the human error, the tunnel vision that can lead to a wrongful conviction. It makes us face the fact that justice isn't always served in this neat and tidy way that we might hope for.
And that's why cases like Jane Dorotik's are so important. They force us to really examine those flaws, to push for reforms, to demand better from our justice system. They remind us that the pursuit of truth and justice, it's an ongoing process, a constant struggle to make sure that the innocent are protected and that the guilty are actually held accountable.
We've spent this deep dive, really unraveling the details of Jane Dorotik's story. But it doesn't end with her release from prison. There are still so many loose ends.
Yeah.
Bob Dorotik's murder is still unsolved, and his family is left without answers. There's this lingering sense of injustice, a void that may never be filled.
It's a sobering reminder that even when the legal system tries to correct its mistakes, even when someone's innocence is finally acknowledged, there are still wounds that may never fully heal and questions that may never be answered.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this deep dive. The quest for justice is often messy and complicated and imperfect. Even when the legal battle is over, the human impact of these cases endures. It makes us ask ourselves, what does true justice actually look like? And how can we work towards a system that is more equitable, more accurate, and more compassionate?
This case is a powerful reminder for all of us to stay curious, to question assumptions, and to never stop seeking the truth, even when it's difficult, even when the path is full of, twists and turns and uncertainties.
That's a great point. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to, keep digging into Jane Dorotik's story and to learn more about wrongful convictions and the fight for justice. There's always more to discover, more to question, more to understand. That's what makes these deep dives so fascinating and so important. Thanks for joining us.